All right, so we're going to go ahead and call policy to order. Attendance, I don't know, do we have been taking a sign-in?
No, we haven't, and I'll record committee members.
Awesome. I think the only one we're missing is Mr. Keenan. But other than that, I think everybody is accounted for.
Krista Ventus is-
Oh, Krista, right, okay. And so we'll move on to section 2 is the cycle. You need a second? Okay. And I just wanted to point out, 8 o'clock, the percussion ensemble is having their send-off show. I think it's actually 8:15 is the first, whatever that is called.
Yeah.
Yes, and right, the parent preview, right. So it would be nice to be able to attend that collectively since we're all here anyway, so maybe we can be efficient tonight, please. Okay, so a policy review cycle, Dr. Russell?
Thank you, Ms. White. And at this point, I will turn this section over to Mr. Weaver. So again, the review cycle policies represent policies that are reviewed every 6 years. And we try and group them so it makes sense that we're connecting ourselves to a particular topic or operation of the district, if you will. So this month, we're featuring 4 business-related or budget-related policies. So Mr. Weaver can speak very briefly. You can see there are no recommended changes, but I'll let him speak to the 4 policies.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Russell. Good evening, everybody. So, as was discussed by Dr. Russell, we do have 4 policies. The good thing is that these are structured in a lot of state code and statutes. So there's not a lot of changes that we need to make. So for instance, in policy 601, fiscal objectives, the only thing we do is a title change. We remove the assistant to the superintendent for business administration and we return that back to business administrator. So 601, straightforward. You can see there's a long line of connections to the state code and also to our own policies specific to fiscal objectives. And I would move that forward as with those small recommended changes. Moving forward to 602. 602, again, weighed heavily in state statute and codes. We do have some adjustment here for recognizing some significant detailed information that we would like and desire to be put in back into this policy. This policy, again, has been traced to our local school districts because we have no PNN directives. This is just a normal review of a cycle review. So items 1 through 8 have been added back in. Those are in our colleagues in our peer districts. So in Springford and in Souderton and Methacton, they have a listing of items. Several policy cycles ago, we removed that and just added the pink section. But the truth and the reality is that we should reflect some of these details that we put into our budget process and put that into our policy. So with the committee's okay, I'd like to move forward with those changes. Again, it now reflects and agrees with the adjustments of our colleagues and our peers. Moving forward to 603, again, very limited change and adjustment in this. All of the language comes from information associated, again, from the state statutes as reviewed by Mr. Subers over the years. So just a change from assistant to the superintendent for business administration back to business administrator. And again, with 604, budget hearing, this one's a little bit bigger, but again, very minor changes associated with the title. And a lot of this was reviewed and put in place associated with conversations specific to Act 1, going back to 2006, 2007. So again, it's a lot of language that we don't really have a lot of means to adjust. A lot of it is in the law, and I would recommend that we move those forward with that minor change as well.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Does anyone on the committee have any questions, comments, concerns about the proposed recommended changes? Okie dokie. Seeing none, we will move on to section 3, which are the PNN recommendations. There are none in April. Moving on to section 4, local policies for review. Dr. Russell?
Thank you again, Ms. White. So this evening we have Officer Fred Moreno here. He has been working with Chief Miller and we'll speak to some of the questions that we might have around policies 222, 226, and 227. So Mr. Miller worked with Mr. Weaver and myself on proposing some revisions based upon some of the questions that came out of last month's policy meeting. So we can go through some of the recommended changes or revisions that have been noted in the policies, and then again, if there are questions from the committee, please feel free to pose them to any one of us. So we'll start with 222, and really there were questions that focused on some of the vocabulary and the language that existed in the current policy and bringing it up to date to some of the language that's more commonly used today to reference these materials. So you can see where there are strikes and where there are some additions in green. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, so we'll move to 226. Policy 226 is entitled Search, and we had some conversation about search. And in this particular policy, there were no recommended revisions on the part of Chief Miller or Mr. Weaver. Are there any questions from the committee about this policy? Okay, so we'll move to 227. And policy 227 is entitled Controlled Substances and Paraphernalia. And there again were just very minor revisions. And the only revision was a reference to policy 805 that was added by Chief Miller. So I think we had some extensive conversation, and outside of committee we're talking about ways to combat vaping, for example, and the use of vaping devices on the part of our students. So these policies came up as part of those conversations. Are there any questions about the review on the part of Chief Miller?
Just for context, just for context, if you don't mind pulling up 805.
Yes.
Oh, I had made you have to leave. I'm sorry.
So, Mr. Weaver, I don't know if you can speak to the why of including 805 as a reference there. Emergency preparedness as it connects to controlled substances paraphernalia. Could have been the Safe to Say program, maybe?
I think that's
to
what it was. It
report
was a reference to the
incidents.
Safe to Say program, yes.
Okay.
So I wonder then if any other language needs to get, if it needs to be kind of expounded upon, rather than just reference the number, maybe point out. Hit the mic, please. Dr. Weston.
If you're going to reference the policy, it should go to a particular section of the, if you're going to reference 805, it should go to the, whatever section of this policy it's applicable to, so.
Yeah,
I'm
hyperlink
trying-
to it.
I'm not sure I see
Okay.
where it
That's-
should be.
That's the way it should be then.
That looks like it's, yeah, it looks like it's 805.1. I'm not sure where 805 was being linked in the eyes of Chief Miller or Mr. Weaver in terms of the language of this policy, but we can certainly go back to Chief Miller, or I don't know if Officer Moreno, you might know where it makes sense to connect 805, which is emergency preparedness.
I'm left to assume that because it's a controlled substance issue, that there might be some distribution behind it, and that's the reason why they want Safe to Say tied into it.
So it seems like we just need to clarify that
Right.
one point, because it wasn't really.
So, let me-
an extensive revision. It just was,
right. So we'll get the specific statement or statements in here where that is intended to serve as a reference. And we'll come back, or I can include it in the notes if the committee's comfortable with that.
yeah, I think that would be
And
suitable.
an explanation where it belongs. Okay.
If I could, I don't want to belabor the subject, I think it might have something to do with, as Fred mentioned, in 227, that law enforcement may have to react to some of that controlled substance action.
Okay.
At some point in time, it goes from 227 to 805.1 for the actions that happen behind the scenes.
Maybe we could just spell it out.
Yeah, so we can get clarity on that. That could be helpful. Great, thank you. All right, so we're going to move on to 218, student discipline. So this is the time of year where administration begins to work with principals on recommendations for revisions, to our student handbooks. And we've been focused on the code of conduct and considering the most appropriate consequences for the infractions that our students commit. So the idea was to review the student discipline policy, one of the admin regs, technically, if you will. How do we uphold student discipline? How do we enact student discipline is defined in the student handbook and the code of conduct in there. So the board will be presented with proposed revisions to the handbook in June before the end of the school year. And the idea would be that they approve those changes, those revisions, and then they can then be communicated to staff and students before the start of the upcoming school year. So with respect to student discipline, I'm going to pull up the draft policy. I'm not sure I'm in the drafts here. Okay. And one revision proposed is to incorporate the same language that appears in Policy 103 when referencing some of the student groups that we think about. And also further down, a copy of the Code of Student Conduct shall be available in each school library and school office and may be included in. So that's an interesting statement, and I don't know that we have a printed copy of the Code of Conduct here in the library. Any student can access the Code of Conduct if they go to our website and they pull up the handbooks. But I don't know how the group necessarily feels about that. The handbooks are certainly referenced, and if students have questions or make certain choices that take us to the handbook, it is reviewed with them when they meet with their house principal. But we don't necessarily have a copy sitting on the desk here in the library or the school office, to my knowledge. We can do that if the committee feels it's important, but again, most access happens electronically. So those would be the proposed revisions to this. And as I mentioned, the conversations will continue as we get into the handbooks.
Does the committee have any comments or questions?
Has anybody ever in recent memory come into the library or the office and asked to see a copy of the Code of Conduct for reference?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question specifically. I'm going to guess if they have, they might be referred to the online version of the handbook, but I don't know that for certain. So I don't know if it's a common question, not to my knowledge.
Okay, so it doesn't seem vital that a printed copy be made available if everybody has access to an online copy.
That would be what I would recommend at this
Yeah.
point. And
Okay.
Mr. Clellan might be able to speak. I don't know if it comes up in any conversations he might have as a representative of the high school. Not to my knowledge.
What's the specific question?
Do you think it would be beneficial to have printed copies of the Code of Conduct handy versus accessing electronically? Have questions come up to your knowledge, say here at the high school, I wish I had a printed copy of the code of conduct. I need to reference it right now, as opposed to looking it up on their computer or their phone.
Well, I was actually just looking at the daily announcements just to see if it's attached there, because I know that some parts of the student handbook are attached every day. Like, after school activity bus, locker request, attendance reminders, student complaint form, parking information, working papers. I mean, we could
Okay.
attach it there.
We could.
So it's
Yeah, we could do that. So there's a link. There's a link there on a daily basis, and we could
Daily
do that at
announcements.
each of the levels. Yeah, middle schools also.
yeah.
So I'm curious whether students are aware that they should familiarize themselves with the code of conduct. So as I recall, at the beginning of each school year, parents are asked to check off, well, yes, I have reviewed the code of, the handbook with my student, but it's in a laundry list of 100 other things that you're checking off and signing off on as you're getting to the start of the school year. And so I don't, especially once you get to the middle school and the high school level, how aware are students of the code of conduct and what the expectations are? And, is there an assembly at the beginning of the school year where students are told, this is your code of conduct, these are the potential disciplinary measure or, consequences that could be associated with it? Is it communicated in some other way than your parent needs to check a box on an enrollment form?
Yes. Yeah, there are grade level assemblies at the beginning of the year, and there's extended homerooms the first week of school where homeroom teachers talk about parts of the student handbook, and discipline is part of that list that we go over each year.
So I guess one of the things that I've been wondering about, as we've been working through some different items with regards to behavior this year, and then kind of like you said, moving into the handbooks. Is there a mechanism, like after those assemblies, for example, by grade, that maybe per homeroom there is some sort of an acknowledgement signed, or by each student taking accountability for their expectations that are expected of them throughout the school year in terms of performance, behavior, almost like an agreement, a mutual agreement, a contract of sorts? Is that a thing that exists? I mean, I know that sometimes when you sign up for a sport or something like that, you would sign that you're accepting responsibility for behaving a certain way in line with participating.
I don't know if students are signing off on something. We ask parents to sign off. I don't know, and I'm not sure if you can address that question, Mr. Clellan.
I think they do. I mean, it's at the beginning of the year. That was a little while ago, but
Yeah.
I think they sign off on it.
We could certainly look into that. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
So I was texting you about that.
Oh, sorry.
Uh,
When I'm in a meeting.
Microphone, go for it.
so students do sign off on 815, the acceptable use policy, and part of that is also the student handbook. So they go through that and then they sign off on that. And whenever they do a password reset, they kind of go through that as well and sign off on that. So there are students signing off on it on an annual basis.
So then I guess then my question would be, is there any accountability associated with an infraction once something happens that you've said you were going to do one thing, but you haven't? And yes, there's a steps that are taken in terms of addressing the infraction itself, but there needs to be. You can use the mic, Jason. Thank you.
The handbook's a large document. A student is signing off acknowledging that they received the handbook, not acknowledging that they read the handbook and will comply with the handbook. It's that it was received and presented to them, and they're acknowledging that they understand what policy 815, how their computer works. You can't create a document in a public school system that states that the student is going to conceptually understand everything in the handbook and adhere to everything in that handbook.
I don't know that I agree with that. I think that if the handbook has certain guidelines that and expectations of student behavior, then I think that by acknowledging that you've received it, I mean, I don't read the terms and conditions on my phone either, but if something ever happened, I would be held accountable to accepting the terms and conditions.
Talking about the high schoolers?
I don't know that you're on.
Are you talking about,
I'm
the
talking
high
ab-
schoolers?
I'm talking about policy 218 and student handbooks in general.
Right. Would you be expecting the middle schoolers to read and understand policy, or the elementary students?
In an age-appropriate way, I think that expectations should be made very clear in terms of what behavior should be in Perkiomen Valley. That's my expectation.
And so I think, just to respond to that question, Mrs. Rudolph, the elementary students have parents sign off on their behalf, I think, except maybe in 5th grade. So I think that's a fair question, and we ask parents to partner with us in helping their students to understand the general expectations and what's expected in terms of behavior. Middle school students are also presented with those overall rules, if you will, and what's expected, expectations for the year. I'm trying to think about the language, and I don't know if Mr. Ganesh can pull it up, the language in the acknowledgement form and how it's presented to students and or parents.
So I was pulling up the handbook page here. So the checkbox says, "I have read, understand, and agree to abide by the student handbook."
Dr. Weston?
Yeah, I've been made aware that apparently there's a statutory requirement here. Looking at the Pennsylvania statutes, 22 PA Code 12.3 says each governing board shall adopt a code of student conduct that includes policies governing student discipline, listing of students' rights and responsibilities. Conduct code shall be published and distributed to students and parent guardians. Copies of the code shall also be available in the school library. Now, I don't know if that means that a
Probably
hard
what's in there.
copy must be available or if an electronic link is sufficient, but, you know, we can debate that question as well.
I mean, I guess my feeling would be, you know, if when you're talking about partnership and you're talking about a certain level of performance, I just think it should be a no-brainer to have buy-in on what the expectations are.
And really, it's not difficult for us to print a copy of the code of conduct and
No,
put it in the
we-
library. We can do it.
I mean about the
And-
signing
probably-
off.
Yeah, and I agree with the
We
acknowledgement,
probably
but
could have
just
printed out a copy of the code of conduct in the time we've been discussing it.
Twice.
So actually, I can, unstrike that, if you will, and we would be happy, certainly want to uphold statute and put a copy here as well as in the main office.
It is riveting reading. Yeah. Are any other comments on that? Alrighty. 249 is cyberbullying. There were no recommended revisions there. Bullying and cyberbullying.
I have a great administrative assistant. She'll help with that.
You usually do it pretty quickly.
So we'll go to 249, which is bullying and cyberbullying, and actually, we are required, in the eyes of the state, to review this policy every 3 years. So it's timely that it's on the agenda right now. And there are no recommended revisions. However, it's clearly a topic that we continue to focus upon. And whether it's bullying or whether it's these negative interactions that we hear about or that our students report, we're trying to combat those and decrease, if not eliminate them. So the policy is important for that reason. And I don't know if there are any questions about the current language in the policy. Administration has no recommended revisions.
One thing that I have heard questions from other people about is the definition of bullying. And I'm just curious where that definition came from and how that definition that is included in here was settled on. Because I think there is amongst the community a lot of misunderstanding between what is a negative interaction, what is bullying, and people. I've heard frustration from people who feel that their children are being bullied, that the school doesn't consider it bullying and isn't doing anything about it. So I'm just curious where, how we arrived at that definition and how it's applied, and just kind of the thought process behind that.
I think that's a great question. So it actually comes from statute section 1303.1. And so the citation number 1 takes us to that section of school code. And you can see towards the bottom, for the purposes of this article, bullying shall mean an intentional electronic, written, verbal, or physical act or a series of acts. And so yeah, that's where it's coming from.
So I guess I understand that there's no revisions recommended at this time, but I'm wondering though if in revisiting behavioral expectations in, eventually in the handbook and then also in 218, if we should put some sort of mechanism in place for there to be an acknowledgement of the language in this policy as well? Or do you feel like that's covered in the handbook?
I think you're, if I'm understanding correctly, you're thinking about being more overt with students about this particular
Correct.
policy. Yeah.
Well,
I don't,
and all expectations in general. I
Yeah.
think that if policy is written, I think that high school students especially, and I do believe middle school students have a perfectly capable understanding of written language in terms of what their expectations should be.
Yeah.
I think that it actually, if for nothing else, it would then create a conversation to have it explained to them, which would even be better, right? That there is really no question at all. Like while you're in the building, these are the expectations that are set out for you, and then there's not really like a variance of I'm in a certain building or I'm in a certain
Right.
grade. There,
Right.
it's a universal expectation as a student of Perkiomen Valley.
and emphasized in the same manner in every building at each
Consistently.
level.
Everybody
Yeah.
gets the same message with the same language.
Sure.
And there's not like this vernacular, grade level assemblies are fun and fine, but I'm sure that this is not getting driven home to the seriousness of taking on the responsibility of being an engaged participant.
Yeah, I think that is a helpful suggestion and recommendation, and I'd like to take that to principals. The other wondering I had is whether or not we should pull more of the language over from school code into this section as we're reading it in school code. I don't know how the group feels about that, but again, to make it very explicit based on what's presented here for students. What characterizes bullying? What comes close to bullying? It's negative. It's unwanted, and we want to stop it.
And I think, when we were talking about the climate survey data, how there were some discrepancies in terms of the number of kids that have seen bullying, have felt bullied. I think that there was clear that the answers were not all in line to the same thought process. But I mean, Mr. Clellan, I don't know, for example, do you, in the language in the school code, do you feel like there is anything that wouldn't be age appropriate for even 6th graders? To me, it's pretty straightforward. I don't. I mean, it's written a little fancy. But at the same time, I just feel like the message, the core of the message is there, and I feel like it could be an opportunity to have a conversation at a more mature level I don't know if you disagree, or, I mean, I'm asking you what your thoughts on.
No, I mean, it could work. It would take time to just kind of work through the language and how it's presented. I mean, I
How it's
think-
presented is the key, right? Right.
Yeah.
And then I
Talking
guess.
about- you're
go
talking
ahead.
about middle school level, right?
I am. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, all levels, I think there should be an understanding, but, you know, bullying happens at the elementary schools too. It's just, I don't know that they necessarily have the words to understand that that's what's happening. I think what I'm getting at is that I think at this point, in addressing behavioral issues, a habitual, you know, type of behavioral issues, at a certain point, we need everybody to acknowledge that
Yeah. I mean, I think
we're
our,
saying it's not okay.
I think our policy is a little bit easier to read for students than
Okay.
the school code, but if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, wherever the language would be more appropriate. And then I don't know if then at that point consequences, you know, and okay, you're agreeing to this. If this is not happening, then this is what, you know, we have. I understand that there's a system in place, but
Yeah, so I think that could be extremely helpful to students and assist them in being very clear on the expectations and being accountable. If it's all right with the committee, I'd really like to look at this language a little bit more closely and see if there isn't any of it that might be helpful in the language of the policy and propose it. And I'll follow up in the notes, and the committee can have a chance to review that. I just want to be sure there isn't something else we should pull over, because there are fewer bullet points, if you will, in the policy versus what's in school code, and I know that they may have collapsed some of them. So if it's all right with the group, I'll follow up. I'd also like to talk to our administrative team about taking that step of being more overt, not only with the code of conduct and the student handbook, but also with the anti-bullying or the bullying, cyberbullying policy specifically, to review that, make very clear to our students what constitutes bullying or negative interactions, if you will, and how they will be held accountable for those behaviors.
yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I'm on board with that. I don't know if the rest of the committee would agree. Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Weston.
Do have another question on the language. If you look at, and you know, Mrs. Lofton's question on where these definitions come from, I think kind of prompted me to look at this a little bit more. Our definition of bullying in the policy refers to actually activity occurring in a school setting and or outside a school setting. If you go to the statute on which we're basing that, it only refers, as far as I can tell, only refers to activity that occurs within the school setting. Now, I think it's perfectly, I support having the and or outside the school setting, but I wonder if there's a way we can, if there's a reference that we can make to that, somewhere in the statutes or somewhere that supports including that in the language, or if we need that at all.
No, I agree that we do need that. I wonder if you've looked at the very last paragraph under III, it does define school setting and includes at any activity sponsored, supervised, or sanctioned by the school. So when our students are at a football game at another school and it's a school district event, they are held accountable to our rules,
Right.
and we can hold them accountable.
But, you know, cyberbullying is covered by the policy, and that does not necessarily appear or engaged in the school setting.
You're right, and cyberbullying is a little bit more tricky for us. However, if there's a nexus that is established and it spills over into the school setting and creates a disruption, then we have access and right to investigate and address that issue, that situation, that infraction.
So then, you know, with regards to the consequences as listed at the bottom of 249, I know I think, Mr. Saylor, you had alluded to the fact that a consequence really should be lack of ability to participate if it should rise to the, to the threshold of that. So that's listed here. And I'm wondering, again, how often the discipline that's taken actually rises to that level. But I do think that consequence sends a message.
The consequence, I'm sorry, where are you reading?
Student violates this policy subject to appropriate disciplinary action.
See.
It goes on to
The bottom.
loss of school privileges or exclusion from school-sponsored activities.
So that is stated in our code of conduct. How often that occurs, I can't speak to that accurately. But I know Mr. Saylor and I have discussed that also as a way to
Send a
a
clear
strong
expectation.
message
Yeah.
and modify the behaviors. That's the purpose of the consequences, to modify the behaviors. And if they're not being modified, do we get stricter with the consequences to make that happen?
Right. I mean, and I would prefer not to have to get to consequences. I think that, to me, that's where I'm coming from in terms of setting the expectation and having the buy-in initially, that you don't ever have to get to the point of having a consequence. Because if everybody knows what they should be doing, there should be no question about
What's possible.
right.
I agree.
Thank you. So the purpose today, we're going through the policy and reading through and saying, is there any changes that we want for the policy? That's one step that's being taken here. And then I've also heard conversation about whether or not, to what degree are students aware of and have been buying into and are communicated to be held accountable to those actions. So do we have a plan in place annually that starts off at the beginning of the year, as I understand it? Students are going through, they've got the handbook, they're supposed to be acknowledging that they have the handbook. But is there are there plans that happen in place then periodically throughout the year that's already planned to reinforce the behavior expectations? So I've heard us kind of talking around it a little bit, but I was just kind of curious about how do we handle that every year so that students really do understand what the expectations are on a consistent basis, and we're just reinforcing the right kind of behaviors. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I can offer just a couple of thoughts, and it would be helpful if we had a principal here, but there are assemblies sometimes that occur during the school year. There are grade level assemblies that sometimes afford touch points about discipline and what's expected of our students. And then there are also in the highlights that at least Dr. Moss puts out sometimes reminders of certain expectations. They may or may not be as directly connected to discipline. But is there another formal grade level meeting? I would say no, I'm not aware of that. But maybe, again, here at the high school, I'm calling on Mr. Clellan a lot tonight, there may be. But there are different types of touch points over the course of the year where those expectations can be reviewed, not in whole, but sometimes in part, and related to whatever might be happening.
I'm sorry, Judy, can I, just a quick follow-up. I think the premise of the question I'm asking too is it more ad hoc situational where something's happened and we want to reinforce, or is it proactive so that we're setting those expectations and reinforcing them on a regular basis? I think it's a little bit of what I was wanting to get at a little bit. And on top of everything else, the administration, the teachers need to do to, teach the students and everything.
So I think some of the assemblies at the middle level are proactive in nature. They're not reacting to an incident that's occurred necessarily, and we need to have an assembly. We right now are aware there are concerns around that, so we are trying to take some steps. But I would say there are pockets of that and examples of where that might occur. As a general tendency on a regular basis every month, this is what we're going to do to thwart bullying or to thwart vaping. PVTV here at the high school will often focus in on some of those conversations and share brief messages that relate, but I don't know that there's an organized long-term plan that addresses it in a systematic manner like you're describing that would be considered proactive instead of reactive. When a student is in the office of a house principal, the code of conduct is being reviewed based on the choice that the student made. That's a reaction. And a review of how you're held accountable in this setting. But a more systematic approach that's more proactive in nature and laid out in a logical fashion could be very helpful.
Do you think that would be something that the climate task force is really going to be? Okay.
I do, yes. And they're meeting for the first time, I think, next week maybe or the week after. So some of those things, I believe we need to take steps that are more overt in that nature, to, again, decrease the sort of responses we're getting, if not eliminate them, so that students aren't feeling the way they're feeling or experiencing what they're experiencing. So I appreciate the suggestion.
I was just
Go
going
ahead,
to
Judy.
suggest something along the lines of some peer-to-peer modeling of appropriate behavior and communication of expectations, so that, you know, the PVTV or working with student leaders and some sort of positive messaging that's coming from the student leaders themselves might be effective. So glad to hear that's happening.
A little bit, yes. But I'd like to look into that more and understand at a deeper level exactly what is communicated when, and I do think the task force will look at things like that too. But peer-to-peer is powerful. Link crew here at the high school in engaging with the ninth graders can be really helpful. So we can build upon that.
Does anyone else have anything on those two? I know that, I guess that we're gonna bring those back for our end of the year kickoff meeting.
Right. So 218 and 249 we'll bring back.
Okay.
Revised based on the conversations tonight, and bullying and cyberbullying, again, maybe some more detailed language. And then in addition to that, I can incorporate into the notes maybe some of the feedback from our administration. As that task force meets, we'll learn more about what it is they suggest. In
Great.
addition.
Alrighty, so then we'll move on to the last item, which is not a policy, but we're bringing it forward based on the adopted policy 109. So I'll leave that to you, Dr. Russell.
Thank you. So I want to call out for the group that my extremely talented administrative assistant, Ms. Laurie Widener, did clean up some of the PDFs. She made them a bit neater. So you might see some differences in the ARs that were posted this weekend for the public versus what you see right now. But these are the administrative regulations that have been developed over the course of the past year and a half or so as we've been talking about resource materials. And the purpose of administrative regulations is to communicate to individuals, administration, professional staff, parents, students, how policy is upheld and some of the things that are done in that effort. So, how are resources selected? AR0 lays out some of the selection criteria. What's new for you tonight is a rubric, and that's AR-1. Librarians are still talking about that, and they're not comfortable, we're not comfortable with exactly the language, but the policy calls out that you use a rubric, or that we rely upon a rubric when we select resources. We rely upon criteria, and there is a specific rubric developed for textbooks. This one is more specific to library materials. So we're working on that, but know that that's another example of an administrative reg that supports the selection process for library materials. And you can see some of the other administrative regulations that are presented here. The weeding of resources, the request for a reevaluation, the form for the reevaluation of a resource material, the checklist for the review committee, the review committee's summary once they meet, and then a parent request for restricted access to certain books or resource materials, as well as the notification. So we had talked about notifying our parents of reevaluated materials. You need to know that some individuals have raised questions about some of these materials. And that AR was also brought back because that was one that was developed. So I'm sharing with the committee all of the ARs, the administrative regulations that have been developed. One other thing I'll call out is the review committee. There had been conversation a while back about making the review committee, a bit more robust. And so what we did was we incorporated we have teachers, administrators, parents, and board representation on this review committee. So it's not necessarily just staff, but we're expanding that as a result of some prior conversations about how that might be healthy for the conversation. So that's a difference that you'll see versus the previous one. So I'm happy to take any questions that individuals might have on these documents. And again, they're flexible. Administration continues to update them to align to the policy and assist in upholding the policy. So they're not something that's necessarily approved by the board, but we are trying to be more transparent with administrative regulations and make them public as we update them. So when policy language is updated, as it was in this particular policy this past month, the admin regs are typically reviewed and updated as well. And as we do that and get them to a place where they're ready for posting, that's what we do. And they're accessible to the public.
Mrs. Lofton.
So I appreciate that you said that this rubric is still under development. And I do just have concerns that some of, I see that these are pulled from the overall criteria that we're using to select our materials. But just for example, looking at the first item, not every book, so I'm assuming this is applying to resources as well as any individual book. And so not every individual book on its own is going to be suitable for varied interests and abilities, but hopefully the collection as a whole would be suitable. So maybe, there might be some items that make sense to go on this 3-point scale, but there might be, I don't know that this 3-point scale of, we need improvement for meeting varied interests, you're not going to be able to get that all within any one single book. Right. So that's where, I'm not sure that this, paradigm of how the rubric is developed necessarily meets the expectations of an individual item as opposed to the collection as a whole.
Yeah, and I appreciate the feedback, and the librarians have expressed the same sort of view. So that's why it's attempted to be very clearly marked as a draft, and that's helpful feedback, and they have the same concern. So how do we make it applicable to all resources? Maybe we need 2 separate rubrics, but certainly we'll look at that, and I appreciate the feedback. Yeah.
Were there any other questions with regards to the process or the application? I know that there was conversation around the policy itself, and I think that the ARs do a good job of explaining the intention of the policy and how it should be carried out.
That is the goal, so hopefully that is the case, yes.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Just a quick question on the review committee, and perhaps I didn't read, and it's in here, and it's just down at the bottom, and I didn't get quite there yet. How are the participants determined for the review committee?
So for the review committees that we've had, I think it's primarily been left to the principal and at the time our humanities supervisor. So we need to rethink that now if we're expanding to include parents and board. And typically if we have board members on any sort of committee, it runs through the board president, and the board president then will delegate based on who might be interested or volunteering. Parents would probably be something that we would ask the principal to consider, who might be individuals to represent the parent stakeholder group on this committee. So I don't have an answer for the actual process. We really wanted to make the committee a little more robust and have it be a little bit more objective in nature, if you will. But I would imagine a lot of that will come from principal and humanities supervisor in terms of how we actually create that committee.
So Alicia, I think to answer your question specifically with regard to the makeup, there isn't a standing committee. It isn't a group of people that it goes to automatically. It's a circumstance based on like an ad hoc. At that now there's a need to have a committee review X, Y, Z, and then at that point the committee is formed. The team is formed. So it's not just okay, like a bat phone, you don't pick up.
So I think, and I don't know, again, Mr. Clellan, if I could ask you, I know you've participated in the past. I don't know whether Dr. Moss asked staff, hey, who would like to participate, or tapped department chairs because they're teacher leaders in the past. Maybe a book connected a little bit to social studies, for example. So did we go to that department chair or teachers from that department? We've tried to be diverse. You know, we're getting better at this because it was something that we hadn't done for some time. So trying to figure out how do we make this as strong as possible a process. So I don't know if Dr. Moss just said, hey, who would like to participate, or if
She asked the English teachers who'd be up for it. Just 'cause reading's our thing.
Were there other questions with regard to the process of review or anything that has to do with the execution of the policy itself?
With the rubric thing, like I know it's still a draft and everything, but is there like a certain number of points that a book would need to make to actually like get accepted or be denied with the rubric system there?
So I think that'll be determined once they finalize the rubric. Right now, for example, if they are looking at textbooks and assessing different textbooks as resource materials to align to a new curriculum, they might take the rubric scores that are the highest and say, okay, this resource earned the most number of points versus this resource. So with library books, I have to talk to the librarians a little bit more about how we actually apply the application, or apply the points, if you will, that are recorded in each of those sections. So stay tuned for that. I think we need more discussion. It's a good question.
So the good thing about the rubric system, and I do think that I guess we're pretty much on consensus that we need a separate one for
Yes.
library
Yeah.
materials, library books rather. That will allow for a non-subjective review and a consistent review across every material that is reviewed. That was like a lot of.
Yeah, I think the librarians are a bit concerned, as I am, about applying a rubric to every single book. So do they apply the
Subjective
rubric
nature to it, right.
yeah, do they apply the rubric to this genre of, say, nonfiction books that we've just gotten in, or this genre of fantasy fiction that we just got in? So we have to work through that, because sometimes they order 200 books a summer, and they don't necessarily need to go through the rubric. They've met the criteria. However, when there are questions, or when there are books that for some raise questions, the rubric might come in handy, and the policy suggests that. So we're working to develop that in a way that's applicable to library books. Yeah.
And quick follow up on that too. Would it just be just a librarian going through the rubric, or would it be like multiple people?
Right now, we've added people to the process. So it starts with the librarian, and then it moves to central office administration, to the supervisor of humanities, and then to what was our assistant superintendent, or now the assistant to the superintendent if we fill that role. So there are a couple of eyes on these selection, the lists of books rather, that are recommended to purchase each year. And sometimes they're recommended by our teachers because they support what it is they're delivering in terms of instruction. So the librarian is supporting her colleagues or his colleagues with some of those books. But there are eyes on that list before it's submitted through a purchase order for purchase. Yeah.
Can you talk about what happens with the books that were not ordered, that are just sent? Because I know that happens a lot from various sources. They're just gratuitously sent to the school.
I don't know. I mean, there was a recent series of books received by an elementary school, for example, and some of those books were inappropriate. They were deemed inappropriate as gifts. I honestly don't know if they were sent back or if they were put in. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, so I'd have to find that out. That's the case I'm aware of right now, and the most recent one. They were.
Are you talking about hard copy donations?
Yeah, yep. Hard copy, and these books happen to be connected to, I believe, religions, and a variety of them, but believed to be at a more mature level than our elementary school students at the time. So I can find that out and incorporate that into our notes.
So would they potentially be moved to, like, say, the middle level? or?
Sometimes they are moved to a different level, yes, and I believe that's articulated in our admin regs. In this case, the donor may have been communicated with that they wouldn't be appropriate for the particular library, but don't quote me on that. Let me find out, and I'll follow up and report it back.
Mrs. Lofton?
So I am curious, you said that oftentimes over the summer, the librarians might be ordering hundreds of books. And so how is that list of hundreds of books generated that make within what the librarians are ordering? How do they determine what goes on their ordering list?
So they follow some of the award-winning books. They read professional journals and articles that make reference to books that right now are geared toward their respective levels of student readers. They also try to support teachers with some recommendations that they might have for their students, maybe based upon some curriculum changes or some newer titles that are out that they would like to freshen up the library with. So there's a couple of different ways that list is developed.
So thinking maybe instead of the rubric, the way the framework has been established right now, the way that's set up, maybe it's some sort of a checklist of, was this recommended by a certain source? And yes, what's the source? Because, also I'm concerned that we would be asking our librarians to read 200 high school level books, and I'm not sure when, and then critically evaluate them, and I'm not sure when they're going to have time to do anything
Mr.
else.
Collins said he likes to read.
Yep. I imagine we want our librarians to do some other things too. So just, as they go through the list, was this recommended by a source? What's that source? And maybe we have whatever the literary sources that they are.
Like based on the answer, what step you take? Like
Or just, I don't know enough about, I don't know, maybe it's, okay, Scholastic recommends this for fourth graders. Great. We like Scholastic. We believe that we align with Scholastic's understanding of the needs of fourth graders, and so therefore Scholastic recommends it, and we're good with it. And then maybe we also, I'm curious if we even have an assessment of, how diverse are the perspectives within our library, and do we have, for example, the perspective of, somebody from any particular country. Maybe we have people in our community who have immigrated from certain countries, and we want to make sure that we have a book in our library that talks about a perspective of somebody from that country. And so, is this meeting the need to bring in, a certain perspective that's been identified as a need within the community? And then that's like a check mark. Yes, these are things that we're checking off. And then, we have do we believe it's appropriate? The factual accuracy, I think, not going to apply to fiction. So,
Yeah, so I think our librarians, just like teachers in a classroom, try to keep up to date with best practices of instruction. Our librarians are trying to keep up to date with meeting our students where they are and having all students in our school communities be reflected in the books that comprise the collection. And a lot of that is through conversation, professional dialogue, attending conferences, and then reading their journals and the reviews. It's part of their job and what they go after, what they seek as they come up with these lists. So I don't know if I've answered your question or maybe completed your thought process around how the diversity in the collection is established or built upon, but those are some of the ways that our librarians think about the books that they recommend for purchase, and they think about all of the students in their school communities and want to make sure, again, that they are represented in the books of the collection.
Do you feel like a rubric is maybe not the best mechanism then?
Oh yeah, so I don't disagree with you, which is why the librarians are also, they're struggling a little. But if you look at the policy, the challenge for us in this policy that was just approved in item number 2 It says direct staff to review a variety of sources using a developed rubric which identifies clear criteria. Now, this really applies to resource materials that align to curricula. So we need a new math text at the middle level. And so when our teachers prepare to review the sources that might end up being a recommended math textbook, they establish a rubric. And then they really assess the different resources that they're reviewing. They pilot them, and there are specific criteria that they consider to make sure it's going to support the students realizing the intended learning outcomes of that curriculum. So it doesn't apply, as you're mentioning, it doesn't apply the same way exactly for library resources, but library resources are in here. So maybe we need a clarifying statement so that we don't get caught up in, hey, you're not applying a rubric to every library book that you order, and the policy says you're supposed to do that. We don't want that to be the case, so we're trying to be really careful. So maybe a checklist is more applicable, or some other approach that helps us to confirm the books have met the criteria outlined in the policy.
And what were the steps that were taken to make sure that third parties didn't have the ability to insert their materials into our library?
So that's a different challenge. I mean, we subscribe to those ebooks, and they give us the list, and the librarians need to review that list before they hit the button and upload or activate those links.
And since we'll just talk about a specific example of what we know, you were mentioning something that might have happened or might not have happened with a donation, but we know that the MCIU pushed this material that we find offensive into our library and we don't want. What steps were taken to reach out to the MCIU and deal with this issue with them? Was it discussed on a broader level between districts? And were other schools, libraries, provided information about what the MCIU had handed out to in their electronic resources? I mean, have you talked to other school districts about this? Do they know that MCIU disseminated this book without their consent?
So you have, forgive me, is McInvia out of the MCIU?
Oh, wasn't it MCIU? I thought it was.
Yeah, so that's why
that
I'm
could have
confused.
been my mistake.
I'm sorry. That's
Where-
why I'm looking confused, because I'm not sure how the MCIU comes in. So the third-party vendor, I think that you're referring to, is McInvia.
McInvia.
Yeah, and it's represented on our website. Yeah.
And are they represented broadly across Montgomery County? So that's what I don't know.
You know what, I was just going to say, I don't know that. I don't know how extensive school districts, whether it's in the Commonwealth or across the nation, rely upon McInvia. I'm just not as familiar with the vendor.
Were they contacted and asked why this happened?
No, I don't think so. No.
It's a nationwide vending system to public school districts, but Dr. Russell mentioned they don't have access to put things in our catalog. They have access to give us books that we can add to our catalog. We have to say yes to the books. So it's more about, before we just say select, accept all, cue it into the system and review them before we enter it in.
One of the questions just is, why now? Why February? And
Oh, they do it all the time.
it has, been incorporated into other libraries in other school districts throughout the nation at different times.
Yeah.
But this one, coming from a vendor that would be large and would have a number of school districts.
No, it just means that in February, someone here said, yes, enter the book.
So, and again, just a step prior to
Did
that.
somebody internally bring that book in? I'm still confused on that question then. Or was it them that pushed the book in?
I would say review the memo that Dr. Russell sent out.
Okay.
Because that answered the how.
Okay.
I don't know if we can discuss it.
I mean, essentially, this vendor gave us a spring batch, is what we called it, a spring batch of books. So I guess maybe there's a couple times a year where we'll get some ebooks. The list comes in first, and then we are responsible for activating that list and making the links to the ebooks active. And this one, the book that you're referring to, was made active before it was realized, and then it was turned off as soon as it was realized that the librarian wouldn't recommend that book. So we have the power, we are in the position to, once they're activated, to turn them off.
But so, Dr. Russell,
Phrase that say we have the power, once they're given to us, to not activate them.
I don't think we are. I think they have to be down, I think they have to be added to the catalog and then deactivated. I'm not certain about that.
That's not what the, yeah. So
I don't think it was said any differently in the memo, honestly, but I believe once that list is added to our catalog, then we have to overtly deactivate.
well, and that can happen in one motion, honestly, if you're sitting and you're clicking one thing, you
Right.
can go through the,
Yeah.
you know ahead of time what the list
Yeah.
is, and you can go and pinpoint
Right.
which ones. I guess, so I just want to clarify what you said, just so we're really crystal clear about it. So in the process of accepting this list, the librarian reviewed the list, I guess, post-activation, but then realized on her own recognizance that this was not a book she would have selected and was like, no, never mind, and deactivated it. Completely separate and like regardless of what any policy says, it was not her professional opinion to put the book in place.
That's correct. And there may have been others that she deactivated. I was focused on.
They just weren't part of the list.
I was just focused on this particular book that's raised a question.
Gotcha.
So shouldn't we be concerned about that? That they're sending books that are not appropriate? Like, should we be looking at them, reviewing them more carefully because they don't seem to have any problem just sending us books that,
So I think some school districts are okay and comfortable with their books. We as a district made a decision with this particular book to deactivate it, but districts have the prerogative, and again, it's based upon their policies and where their community is with respect to what they believe is appropriate for their students.
so shouldn't we be more carefully reviewing the books that are coming from that vendor since we now have a better idea of where their parameters are?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's reassuring. Thank you.
Does anyone?
If
Go ahead, Mr.
there are
Keenan.
more vendors, I mean, it's just an easy suggestion to say,
That's something
look
that I
for
brought
other
up as well.
vendors.
Is there a vendor that allows for a filtering
all.
mechanism?
I gotcha. Okay, that's something I can look into. I don't know, but it's a fair question. I don't know if there are other vendors that provide the same service. I can look into it.
Or just the services, but in different ways that would work better with
Right,
our
right.
administration.
More checks and balances, yeah.
Are you at the mic? We get a lot of complaints that we can't hear you.
It's our librarians who bring in the books.
That's
They don't have
correct.
access. No. You mentioned that they have access and then we have to deactivate the books.
That's right. So the librarians click the button to add them to the catalog
Yeah.
and then can deactivate the link in the case of an electronic book.
Correct, but they get the list of the books
That's correct. They get the list first.
before they activate it.
That's correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
But they're not activated individually, I think is what Dr. Russell was
Or
saying.
they can't not activate a book is what I'm questioning. I'm not certain of that. So I just want to make sure we have the order of events. They get the list, they upload them to the catalog, and then if there's a book in there they'd rather not have in the library collection, they deactivate the link. Yeah.
But that's all sequential. It's upload and then deactivate.
Yes, right.
Not upload and then a month later deactivate.
Or it's not upload some of them, but not all of them.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not positive of that, but I believe that's the sequence. Yeah.
Why, who determines that they have to be activated or not?
Well, it starts with the librarian, and if there are questions, the librarian and I have a conversation. And again, that's per policy.
No, I mean, why does it, you're saying you're not sure if the librarian is required to activate it and then can go back and deactivate it. Who decides if that librarian must activate it or has a choice whether or not to activate it?
It's just part of the process. It's just part of how we get the links from the company.
Wouldn't it make more sense to not automatically activate it?
It would, but I don't know that the process works that way. Again, that's what I need to look into. I think once you get the list, the sequence is they all get activated and uploaded to the catalog, and then you have to go in and deactivate the ones that you would prefer not be a part of the collection. Yeah.
So I just wanted to go back to the rubric discussion we had a minute ago, and I appreciate that the board just approved a policy that says that we have to have a rubric, and so I started wondering about the definition of rubric, and so I Googled how is How is rubric defined in education? And the education glossary says a rubric is typically an evaluation tool or set of guidelines used to promote consistent application of learning expectations. So I don't think, we typically think of a scoring rubric where you have a score for, different levels of performance, but it really just can be an evaluation tool by definition.
Maybe we should include the definition for rubric in the policy.
Or
Or in the AR at
or
least.
incorporate a set of guideline or a set of criteria, yes.
Because
Have Judy
a
make
scoring, a scoring
Well, she's
rubric
here.
makes perfect sense for evaluating a curriculum material like a textbook, but it
Right.
doesn't make sense necessarily the way we've applied it for a fiction novel.
I agree completely, and I appreciate that you looked up the definition because that's much more practical to the purpose here. Yeah, good.
You beat Dr. Weston to it. Does anyone have anything else? Dr. Russell?
I think that covers it, so I appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, so, go ahead.
My question is just about the ARs. How do we know when an AR is updated? Because they can be updated at any time, right?
So they're posted in board docs. You just have to watch board docs and check and see. Oftentimes it follows the approval of policy.
But it doesn't have to. It can
No,
be
it doesn't
at
have
any.
to.
So just to be clear, an AR can be updated by administration at any time, and anything it can just be updated.
It can be. That's possible, yes.
So that is a little concerning to parents, because we would have to be looking at all times and, reviewing that. Is there a way to make a little bit more transparency to the community?
So do you understand, though, that the AR is actually just instructions to administration?
Oh, I understand what ARs are very well, and that's why I have concern.
There are, I think, close to 500 ARs. You wanted a queue system to get an email out.
I don't
to
know,
5,000
I'm just saying, what
parents
can
every-
we,
Well, hold on, because ARs get updated all the time, even with minor things like they go from 23 to 24.
Right.
Because it's the new year. So you would want to get
Yeah.
a queue system that says,
I don't know, I'm just bringing it up.
So I think what I would say to that is, and in response to your questions and comments, what I would say to that is if there is something major that has been updated, student handbooks are ARs, they're administrative regulations, and they are introduced to our board in the summer, they are introduced to parents at the start of the school year. They're revised almost every year on a regular basis. If there are other ARs that are
I
really
mean, the ones
salient.
that are done every year, because we're discussing that in the meeting, and everybody can read the minutes or watch, listen to the meeting, and they'll know what updates are happening for the code of conduct. But I mean the ones that are changed that parents might want to know about.
So I guess my response as a parent would be, or I mean, my 2 cents, I don't know, whatever perspective you want it to be. To me, if the policy's not changing, how they get the policy done shouldn't necessarily matter. And I'm not quite sure I'm understanding why there's a concern around the AR.
You don't understand why there's a concern around ARs?
No, because board writes policy, and the policy is expected to be upheld. So if the administration feels as though they need to revise an AR to make sure that the policy is enforced, I don't understand. I guess I'm concerned about the in the weeds nature of being part of that dialogue, because parents and board, none of us are responsible for the content of ARs. Administration is.
Right. Exactly. Parents have no way of knowing about AR changes unless they're diligently checking the board docs to look that
I
up.
think I might be missing the point.
And
Yeah.
and I would
point
just
at me, because I get the EBGBs, I don't believe we should even be talking about ARs, because we don't.
Well, the
they're
reason
not
we're talking about
No, I'm
ARs
just
is
saying, we don't, they're not under our jurisprudence.
Your purview.
As a board.
no, correct, absolutely, I agree with that. But I think at the same time, there have been instances where there has been a lack of understanding about how policies are enforced. And so that's when ARs became part of our conversation at the policy committee. So it's really just a, what do you call it? Not a luxury, what's the word? Yeah, like for like a gratis sort
Yeah,
of thing that
right.
we're having the conversation
Right.
openly,
Right.
and you are accepting feedback. But at the end of the day, we as a board charge administration with executing 109, and these are the instructions to do it.
Right.
And to my knowledge, we are the only school district in Montgomery County, because I looked last night, that has ARs as part of their board docs.
Right.
We're one of the fewer districts, because not all districts actually have a full policy manual available on
Right.
board docs. Some have, what I would call spliced up manual, and then only
Yeah.
board members have the full manual.
Right.
And we are, I know for a fact, the only one in Montgomery County and Bucks County that actually have their policy minutes going back to
Right.
2010, because that's, I guess, when board docs
Right,
was
that's
formed
what-
as an organization.
Right.
And, I mean, people. I have conversations with colleagues, board colleagues, and they're just shocked about how much we discuss with the community and the
ARs
public. So
change all the time. They should change all the time, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff in ARs that need to get changed.
based on circumstance, right?
HR person,
Right.
when there was like 150 ARs that have his name in it. So when Ryan started, that all changes. The
Right.
dates change. There's
Right.
a lot of information.
They're
that changes.
designed to be fluid.
Oh, they
Right.
have to be.
Right.
So the other thing I would offer, Mrs. Rudolph, is that when policy changes, you have to watch the board meetings, and you have to monitor what's happening at the board level. I mean, we're not announcing that, but you have a responsibility as part of our community to follow that, and the ARs are posted along with those policies when they're appropriate and necessary in helping everybody to understand very clearly how policy is upheld. We have attempted to be very transparent, as Mr. Saylor is alluding to, by sharing this information and making them public. We're not hiding anything. We're actually trying to be more informative. But there's not a memo that goes out every time an AR is necessarily updated, but it can often follow a policy update.
And they are dated then if they're touched.
Yeah, they're dated.
So we should just remind the community that it's their responsibility and it's available, and they should be checking for anything that they may have concerns about or are particularly interested in, that they should be checking ARs for specific policies regularly to see if there are changes.
I think if the community is concerned about a particular policy, they would go to the policy first to see what the actual expectation is. And then if there were, not every policy has ARs attached to it.
Right.
So to follow ARs is, again,
Some of the more concerning ones, the books have been a big issue,
Okay.
bathrooms,
and
bullying.
all of those are public.
Right, yeah, so it's just a good opportunity to remind the public to really be looking, because to familiarize themselves with the policies and where to look for them, and to be checking for the ARs, because they might be changing.
Thank you for that reminder, Mrs. Rudolph. Did you have anything to add, Judy? I'm sorry.
I
Dr.
was
Russell.
just going to say, and if there are ever questions, hopefully parents know to reach out to a building principal or to me. I'm happy to address those questions.
Okay, great.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right. Anybody else? Mr. Ganesh? Anything? Mr. Weaver? Mr. Moreno made it through his first policy meeting. Congratulations. All right. That's all she wrote. I think we'll move on to closing items. Policy meeting minutes will be posted following the meeting. Our next meeting date will be the final for the school year. It's May 21st. Be here or be square. 6 p.m. 5.03, notice of video recording disclaimer, and 5.04, adjournment.